Hello, this is Kirsten Smith, Collections Curator at the Alberni Valley Museum. This week on Museum at Home, we're looking at the Cameron Lake Chalet. The Cameron Lake Chalet is part of the tradition of Canada's Grand Railway hotels. It was constructed by the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, in 1910 to 1911 on the eastern shore of Cameron Lake. It was both a station and a resort to encourage tourist travel on the CPR's Vancouver Island subsidiary, the E&N Railway. The CPR saw the economic benefits of tourism. In the 1880s, it played a key role in the development of the national park at Banff, including the construction of hotels and facilities. This was repeated on Vancouver Island, where they opened the Empress Hotel in 1908, with easy access to both their steamship line on Victoria's Inner Harbour and the E&N Railway that would open up the rest of Vancouver Island. The look of the chalet followed a pattern of smaller railway hotels and lodges with shingled bungalow and Tudor Revival elements. It was one of two lodges on the island, the other being Strathcona Lodge on Shawnigan Lake. As with their other resorts, the CPR constructed recreational facilities for the tourists, including a hiking trail from Cameron Lake to Mount Arrowsmith. With the arrival of the train at Cameron Lake, the stagecoach from Port Alberni to Nanaimo altered its operations to take passengers to the chalet station instead. That was until December of 1911, when the first train came into Port Alberni and the stagecoach stopped entirely. The Cameron Lake Chalet was furnished and ready for business in May of 1912, as the CPR anticipated a busier tourist season with the newly opened rail line to Port Alberni. Although lacking electricity in the early years, note the coal oil lantern on the mantel, the chalet was outfitted in a relatively luxurious manner, following CPR corporate conventions. Our interior photos all date from around 1960, but you can get a hint of the previous grandeur when the hand-planed interior wood paneling was complemented by red carpets and all the hardware was brass. The bathrooms had clawfoot tubs, and the guest rooms were outfitted with large beds, washstands, and china. Some of the furnishings were saved and form one of the earliest donations to what became the Alberni Valley Museum. Typically, you find this furniture upstairs in the museum, the bed in pieces, though during our temporary exhibit, Vacationland, we had the bed put together and made up. The furniture is reputed to have come from Scotland and was very heavy. In 1958, most of the chalet's rooms still had the original bedroom sets, and guests preferred these rooms, though the staff not so much, as they found it difficult to move when they needed to clean. The chalet had 10 guest rooms. A couple of accounts note only 5 rooms, but the original guest books assign guests to 10 different rooms. Hotel rooms in that time period wouldn't have been as spacious. There were no king-size beds, and they wouldn't have had an attached bathroom. In fact, there was no running water in the guest rooms. In the summer, when it got busy, additional guests could be accommodated in tents. Meals were served in the dining room, a long room along the south side of the building. Tables would have been set with embroidered tablecloths and blue willow china. Guests would have had full board along with their rooms. In the guest book, you can see that the arrival and departure times are listed as meals. Locals, too, would come to the chalet for meals. Some would come for tea or for Sunday dinner, while others would break their journey between Port Alberni and the East Coast by having lunch here. Though today it only takes 20 to 25 minutes to get from Port Alberni to the chalet location, in 1912 it would have been a longer journey. The cars didn't go as fast, provided of course that you had a car and weren't traveling by horse and buggy. And the road wasn't paved. It was rocky and twisty. There was a bridge out over the lake as you went around Angel Rock, and in some spots, like in Cathedral Grove, the road was only wide enough for one car to squeeze between those giant trees. Guests at the chalet would come for a weekend getaway or a week-long excursion of boating, fishing, and hiking. Here we see a guest entry for boats only. In 1912, the CPR built a trail from the chalet up Mount Arrowsmith. It was well marked with stone cairns, so visitors could easily find their way down in the fog. About 12.5 kilometers from the chalet, they built a cabin, a sort of base camp on the tree line. It was stocked with a cook stove, utensils, and dishes so that guests could make a short stay up there. Pack horses were available to carry things up so guests wouldn't be encumbered, and the guests could even ride the pack horses as far as the cabin. From that cabin, you could take the easier hike up Mount Coakley or the more challenging hike up Mount Arrowsmith. The trail was used by guests and locals. There's a story of 8 young men who hiked the trail in August of 1927. They left Port Alberni after work on Saturday at 9 p.m. They reached the cabin, pictured here, on the slopes of Mount Coakley at 3 a.m., where they slept until 5 a.m. On Sunday morning, 5 of them made it to Coakley Ridge, and these 3, Win Beck, and the brothers John and George Williamson, made it to the summit of Mount Arrowsmith before they all headed home Sunday afternoon. The trail still exists and is still enjoyed by locals. Here we see the Tuesday morning hikers in 1987 on the Arrowsmith Trail. In its early years, the chalet was operated directly by the CPR. The first managers were Mr. and Mrs. Adam Monks, with Mr. Monks also serving as the hunting and fishing guide. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Monks was killed in 1917, serving in World War I, and after a few more years, his disheartened widow turned over the operations to Mr. and Mrs. Woollett. Mr. Woollett had retired as head steward of CPR coastal ships. Mrs. Woollett was interviewed in 1969. She was 97 at the time. One of her memories of the chalet was a time when a snowstorm cut them off and they had to wait for the snowplows to dig them out. When the Wooletts left in 1938, the CPR leased the chalet to a series of operators. Jacques Larocque was the last to operate it as a resort from 1958 to 1966. Following the trajectory of other Alberni Valley destination resorts, it appears that the chalet flourished as a tourist operation in the years up to and following World War II. The chalet guest books from 1912 to 1917, donated to the Alberni District Historical Society by Mr. Larocque, show that many of the guests were the elites from BC, the USA, and Europe. They included politicians, business owners, capitalists, and even a few aristocrats. The CPR strategy of providing a conveniently accessed mountain wilderness vacation only a few hours away from Victoria seems to have succeeded. Many of the guests arrived with servants, and in many cases were driven there by chauffeurs. The register reveals that half of the guests were from Vancouver Island, including many from Victoria, but only 4% of them from the Alberni Valley. A quarter of the guests were from BC's Lower Mainland, and 15% from the USA, with the other 10% from the rest of Canada or Europe. In these early years, the chalet was a destination resort where visitors would often stay for a week. However, in the 1950s and 60s, as automobile transportation improved with the Pacific Rim Highway and the E&N abandoned its passenger service, it simply became a stop on the way to somewhere else. Viability as a resort had ended, and combined with its deteriorating condition, it was demolished around 1969, signaling the end of the era of rail tourism in this region. That's all for this week. I hope you've enjoyed watching the Alberni Valley Museum's Museum at Home.